So consciousness is a term that goes in many directions, and we've explored just a few of the senses of it here in this section. But you can now distinguish various senses which are important to keep apart. So we met access consciousness, this idea of that there's some stuff you can report on, some stuff stored which you could access but is harder work to access, and we saw the development of the global workspace theory there. We met the hard problem of consciousness, or qualia and phenomenal consciousness. We met the very useful notion of states of consciousness. We saw, as we looked at the easy questions, that some scientists are exploring neural correlates of consciousness. The hard question is phenomenal consciousness, it's on there twice, and we looked at the way in which our talk of attention gets mixed up with our talk of awareness and consciousness in psychological speak. So given all that, who's an expert on consciousness? Well, I think the answer has to be nobody, because the term means something very different as we explored all these different senses. Lots of people have interests in this area. So clinical neuroscientists have an urgent need to distinguish between someone who's healthy and someone who's in a coma, for example. And the methods of neuroimaging, as here, will be useful for that. And in that sense, clinical neuroscientists have expertise in this area, but they're using the word consciousness in the sense of states of consciousness that are clinically relevant. That's not going to cover many other uses that we might have, but it's a very important sense in which consciousness is explored. When we get to the psychologists, we find a lot of consideration about questions of attention and awareness. And here, in order to explore the word consciousness further, you have to buy into a lot of terms of art of psychology, which belong to psychology and which you're entirely free not to use. So the problematic notion of attention. In class, we'll have looked at how psychologists study attention in automatic and controlled processes, using experiments like the Stroop test. But attention is a problematic construct. Psychologists use it all the time and are very sure that they know what they're talking about, but pay attention to the language that's used when someone uses the word attention. If you say, I'm paying attention, you're treating attention economically, as if you had a limited amount of it and you could spend it here, there, or everywhere. That's a metaphor that psychologists have developed. There are other senses of the word attention, particularly in meditative traditions, where attention refers instead to a general state of receptivity, of openness to the world. And that's different from the way psychologists have developed the notion, using an economic model. So they are, in a sense, studying something to do with consciousness, but again, using their own in-house vocabulary and their own set of ideas. Psychiatrists are interested in consciousness for different reasons. This gentleman is in a catatonic state. You may encounter someone in a state of consciousness that you not only have to distinguish, but have to deal with and try to understand. Here, the constructs of the psychologist are probably not going to be much use. The experience of the clinical neuroscientist may be of some relevance, but psychiatrists have other questions. So psychiatrists have a separate interest in matters to do with consciousness. As the word is explored, philosophers get in on the act. There's a lot of philosophy of consciousness. There's a whole branch of continental philosophy known as phenomenology, which takes consciousness as its object, as it were, although consciousness makes a very poor object. That's why this is philosophy. It has its own technical vocabulary, which I didn't bother introducing you to, and we'll move rapidly along. But philosophers are definitely in on the act in their own way. Cognitive science has yet to fully meet physics. There are physicists and cognitive scientists who collaborate and who work, and there are physical models of consciousness, not least in the field of quantum physics. But this stuff gets so outlandish that very few people can follow it. And it's not clear that it's terribly relevant to many people. But we could say the overlap between physics and the science of consciousness is an area in which future research is needed. We met Sigmund Freud earlier on, and there's something from Carl Jung's world as well. Psychoanalysts study consciousness in their own way, with their own concerns and with their own assumptions. These may be particular to one school or other of psychotherapy, and there are many schools of psychotherapy, but they too can legitimately claim to be exploring senses of the word consciousness. There are others. I've mentioned contemplative traditions, meditation techniques, the whole world of yoga, of Buddhist practices, is full of discussion of consciousness, of 2,000 years of rigorous philosophical inquiry into consciousness, always elaborated within one school or another school, not elaborated with scientific purposes in mind, but there is a real sense in which the experts in the contemplative traditions are the real experts in consciousness. But they won't be answering questions that the psychologists and the psychiatrists have. Poets, artists, and musicians are also, to some extent, concerned with consciousness. What's the range of possible experience? In some sense, your living is an exploration of consciousness. So in some sense, you study consciousness, whether you do so scientifically or not. There's been a long-running conference that's been going for about 25 years. It used to be called Towards a Science of Consciousness. And for many years it was understood there's no science of consciousness. These days, the same conference is called The Science of Consciousness. It's avant-garde stuff. Well, what are the kind of topics that are studied there? Well, states of consciousness. For example, in the 2022 iteration, we had sessions on sleep, wakefulness, and anesthesia. We had sections on the brain and consciousness. We had sections on altered states. We had sections on psychedelics. This is a really interesting area that has only fairly recently opened up as the rhetoric around war on drugs has shut up a little bit, thank God. And people have real questions about experiences on psychedelic drugs, which are now being mined both for therapeutic use, but also for personal exploration, as they always have been. There's a section there on astrobiology and astroconsciousness. Not having been at the conference, I don't really know what went on there. Dave Chalmers was there with a session on reality plus, or the role of virtual realities and augmented realities and matrix-like thinking in how we think about consciousness. And there was some overlap with the physicists in quantum neuroscience. So there's work exploring all these areas and many more. We need to talk just very briefly to wrap up about this distinction, the distinction between something being objective and something being subjective. In everyday discourse, it's taken for granted that science deals with objective stuff. That's what science is the treatment of objectivity. And furthermore, in science, there's a widespread belief that science doesn't traffic in values, it only traffics in facts. That was probably true for about 5 minutes in the 17th century. No, it's never been true. Science has always trafficked in values. In physical sciences, the contents of physics tries to keep itself value-free, and it constructs a form of objectivity unique to physics. Biological objectivity is different. When we get into the psychological and the social sciences, good luck. And there's a reason that we don't simply insist that science only has to do with objectivity. If we did so, we could do no science that had anything could shed any light on suffering, on meaning, on value, on feelings. If science is any good at all, it's going to help us get by in the world, right? So we haven't explored it much in this module, but there's a whole new field, as it were, in which the notion of consciousness and mind are explored not with respect to brains or individual persons, but with respect to the processes of life. This comes from philosophical biology and also with overlap from Buddhist philosophy. Now, you may think it is just another avant-garde direction in cognitive science, but such considerations seem to me to be very, very important because humanity needs to understand its place within nature. Given the scale of the ecological disaster that we and subsequent generations are living through, a reconsideration of our place within things seems to be necessary. And here, the world of embodied cognitive science, and specifically the field of inaction, may have contributions to make in the future. Just to show you that there is work going on, there's a selection of books over the last few years in this general field, any of which might interest you, but we don't have time to discuss them. I hope I've made the case that the study of consciousness is both difficult and rewarding. It's not just another topic. As we explore notions of consciousness, we may be working on a creative new view of who we are, what we are, and how we fit into things like cosmos or nature. I believe things are just kind of taking off. Now, if you found the content of this module stimulated your thinking, and if you'd like to pursue the themes in this module further, we have at UCD a 12-month taught master's degree, which I run. It's designed to further explore the themes we've raised in this module, and it's definitely not intended as a vocational preparation. The topics of cognitive science are too important to be hijacked by industry or state authority. So it's ideal preparation for continued research in cognitive science. It is emphatically not a psychology degree or a step towards a caring profession. Psychology is relevant to cognitive science, lies together with many other disciplines, as it were, within the broad field of cognitive science, but to adopt purely psychological approaches would be to miss the interdisciplinary challenges of cognitive science. So if you found these themes interesting, and if you like the idea of mixing your science with some philosophy, this might be for you. Hit me up for any questions about that program. So we're going to wrap it up. And in thinking about the contemporary state of cognitive science, which as we've seen is going all kinds of directions, I'd like to make a plea for thinking of the position of the alchemist. Alchemy is an old business. The word alchemy means different things to different people, as usual. But we recognize in alchemy a lot of richly creative, imaginative, pre-scientific work in which people were doing experiments trying to turn lead into gold or trying to reach higher planes of consciousness. There's different kinds of alchemy. We regard it as not particularly scientific activity, but Sir Isaac Newton, founder of physics, as it were, Robert Boyle, the chemist, all the founders of modern physics and chemistry would have described themselves as alchemists. They were alchemists. It's only in retrospect that we can say that made it into science, that didn't. And the exploration that pushes the forefront of science, that opens new possibilities for scientific work, is always ongoing and is more like alchemy than chemistry. Cognitive science is ongoing and creatively exploring new ways to make use of science to better understand ourselves. So that's the end of the module, and I hope you enjoyed it.